At exactly 6 o'clock on Christmas evening, my phone rang 23 times in under 10 minutes. I know the number because I counted them afterward, the way a man counts the rings of a tree he has finally decided to stop watering. At the time, I was doing nothing at all. I sat in a chair by a cold-glassed window with a cup of coffee going lukewarm in my hands, watching new snow move sideways across a Vermont hillside. The only sounds in the cabin were the small arguments of the fire and the slow breathing of an old dog asleep against my boot. It was the quietest I had been in 15 years. Then the screen lit up and the quiet ended. One call. Another. 3 more stacked on top of it. Text messages arrived so fast the phone could not stop trembling on the table, a small trapped thing buzzing itself toward the edge of the wood. My ex-wife, my son, my daughter, all of them reaching for me in the same breath at the same minute from 400 miles away. The strange part was not that they were calling. People call. The strange part was that I had known, for weeks, the exact minute they would begin. I had circled it in my mind, the way you circle a date you are both dreading and waiting for. 6 o'clock. Christmas Day. I had simply decided this one year not to answer the way I always had. Have you ever been blamed for the very thing you were holding up with both hands? Have you ever paid for something for so long that everyone forgot it was a gift and started treating it as rent? For 15 straight Christmases, I paid for every part of the holiday my family assembled around themselves. The cabins, the catering, the gifts nobody remembered until the following year when they wanted better ones. And still, somehow, in every one of those 15 years, I was the problem in the room. This year I changed one thing. Or rather, I stopped doing one thing. And at 6 o'clock, the consequences of that stopping finally came looking for me. Before I tell you what happened when the snow started, and the phone would not, let me ask where you're watching from tonight. Wherever you are, pull your chair a little closer to the fire. If a story about family, money, and the quiet cost of always saying yes is the kind of story you came here for, then stay with me and consider following along, because everything that broke open at 6 o'clock had actually begun to crack many months before. In a silence nobody in my family thought to notice. Renata and I divorced almost 16 years ago now. The marriage ended the way a lot of marriages end, not with a single wound, but with a slow leak neither of us knew how to patch. She told me, near the end, that I had no ambition. That word followed me for years. What she never said, because I never told her, was that the reason I looked so unambitious was that I had spent every spare dollar quietly paying down the mortgage on the house our children were growing up in, so that whatever else fell apart, the roof over Grant and Paige would not. I thought that was a kind of ambition. She thought it was a lack of one. We were both, in our own ways, sure we were right. I was a structural engineer for most of my working life. I spent my days making sure that things which looked solid actually were, that the beam could carry the load it was asked to carry, that the weight was distributed so no single point took more than it was built to hold. It is a strange thing to be good at that for a living, and to understand it so poorly in your own home. When the marriage dissolved, one tradition refused to dissolve with it: Christmas. Back when Grant and Paige were small, I understood exactly why it mattered. I did not want my children shuttled between 2 houses on the one morning of the year that was supposed to feel like home. I did not want them learning to choose sides before they were old enough to shave or to drive. So when Renata suggested, that first December after the divorce, that we all rent a cabin together in Aspen and keep the holiday whole for the children's sake, I said yes without a second thought. And the first year was good. I want to be honest about that, because it is the thing that kept me paying for so long afterward. That first year, we sat around a real fire, and the children laughed, and no one argued about custody schedules or pickup times. For 3 days, we were something that looked, from the outside and even from the inside, like a family. I have spent a lot of money since then trying to buy that first year back. You cannot buy it back, I know that now. It took me 15 tries to learn it, because the trips changed. Slowly, the way erosion changes a coastline, so gradually you do not notice until one day the shape of the whole thing is different, and you cannot say exactly when it happened. What had started as a modest cabin and a shared meal became, one December at a time, a production. The cabins grew larger and the catering grew fancier and the gift lists grew longer. And every year the numbers on the receipts climbed while the amount of gratitude in the room stayed exactly, stubbornly, the same. Grant learned early what the season could deliver. One year it was designer sneakers, the kind that cost more than my first car had. The next year it was electronics, then a watch, then things I could not have named or pronounced if you had put a gun to my head. He did not ask for these things so much as file them, like a man submitting a requisition to a department he assumed would always approve it. Page was gentler about it, but the shape was the same. Every December arrived carrying a fresh list of special items, special experiences, special upgrades, as if the holiday were a service, and she a customer who had noticed some room for improvement. Renata had opinions about everything, and she delivered them with the calm confidence of a woman who had never once been handed the bill. The cabin needed a better view, the menu needed more options. The decorations looked, one year in her exact words, a little economy. Every December there was a new expense, waiting just around the corner of the last one, and every December I paid it. Not because anyone thanked me. They rarely did. I paid it because I had convinced myself that keeping the peace was worth whatever it cost, and because I was afraid, though I would not have used that word then, that if I stopped paying, there would be nothing else holding us together at all. That was the real bill, if you want to know. Not the money I could replace. It was the arithmetic underneath the money that wore me down. I could spend $8,000 building the exact holiday they had described, down to the brand of the candles, and within the hour someone would find the flaw in it. If the drive up the mountain was slow, I heard about it. If a restaurant seated us 10 minutes late, that became, through some private family logic I never mastered, my fault. If the snow was too cold, and I want you to sit with how strange that sentence is, if the weather itself displeased them, the displeasure found its way, eventually, to me. For a long time I explained it away. Families argue, I told myself. The children will mature, I told myself. They are young, they will grow out of it. Next year will be different. But next year was never different. The gifts changed, and the cabins changed, and the years changed, and the one thing that never changed was the seat I was assigned in every room. The seat of the man who pays and is grateful to be allowed to. And then one December I noticed the thing I had spent 15 years arranging not to notice. In all that time, across all those trips, not one of them had ever asked me how I was. Nobody asked whether I still wanted to do this. Nobody asked whether I could afford another Christmas more expensive than the last. There was only ever one question, unspoken but total, hanging over every plan they made. Was it paid for? That was all they needed to know about me. Whether it was paid for, that realization did not arrive as anger. I almost wish it had. Anger would have been easier, cleaner, quicker to burn off. It arrived instead as a kind of cold, quiet clarity, the way the temperature drops just before real snow. They were not excited to see me. They were excited to see what I had bought. And that, though I did not know it yet, was the ground the whole next year would be built on. Last Christmas was supposed to be the year it all finally went right. That is what I told myself anyway, as I approved one payment after another in the weeks leading up to it. The cabin alone, a great glass and timber place called Silver Ridge Lodge, perched above the town, cost more than some families spend on an entire year of vacations. Then the catering, then the gifts, then the long tail of small expenses nobody thinks about until they surface on a statement. By the time Christmas Day arrived, I had spent a little over $8,000. And I want to be clear, because this is the part people find hardest to believe. I was not angry about the money. I have never been a man who loved money for its own sake. What I wanted, what I was actually buying with all of it, was a few hours of watching my family be happy in the same room. For most of that day it looked like the purchase might go through. The lodge was beautiful. The long table sagged pleasantly under the weight of food. The fire threw its warm, moving light across the ceiling, and wrapped gifts sat in a bright heap beneath the tree that touched the rafters. Everyone seemed for a while genuinely happy, and I let myself believe, the way I always let myself believe, that this year we would get all the way through the holiday without a single complaint. I was wrong, but I was wrong later than usual, which felt almost like progress. It came apart after dinner. Grant opened the gift I had spent 3 weeks hunting down, a watch of a particular make he had specifically named, the kind of thing you have to know someone to even locate. When he saw the name on the face of it, he smiled for perhaps 5 minutes, and those 5 minutes were, I realize now, the last uncomplicated happiness I would buy in Aspen. Then he began pressing the buttons, turning the crown, frowning at the little dial. His face changed the way other changes on a mountain, all at once and without warning. "Dad, what's wrong with this thing?" I looked up. "What do you mean? It stopped. It's not working. I assumed reasonably that it was nothing. A setting, a protective mode, a battery that needed a few hours. The ordinary small troubles of any new device. But Grant reacted as though the thing had detonated in his hand, as though I had wrapped an insult and put his name on it. "You spent all this money," he said, loud enough that the table went still, "and you couldn't even make sure it worked." The room went quiet in that particular way a room goes quiet when everyone is deciding whether to look at you. I said calmly that we could call the retailer after the holiday, that these things were almost always simple to fix. That only seemed to make it worse. And then, before I could get another word out, Renata set down her wine and joined him, in the tone of a woman confirming something she had long suspected. "Honestly, Nathan, this is exactly the kind of thing you do." I turned to look at her. "What is that supposed to mean?" She gave a small shake of her head, almost pitying. "You always cut a corner somewhere." I sat with that. Cut a corner, after $8,000, after 3 weeks of searching, after a trip I had never once asked to take. I had cut a corner. And before I could answer, Paige, my Paige, added her small stone to the pile. "It's like you always find a way to mess something up." The words did not hurt because they were new. They hurt because they were so old. I had heard versions of that exact sentence for 15 years, worn smooth by repetition like a stone in a river. The only thing different that night was me. For the first time, something inside me simply declined to reach for the usual excuse on their behalf. I did not defend them to myself. I did not think, "They are tired, they do not mean it." I just sat there and let the sentence be exactly as ugly as it was. While the three of them talked on, I looked slowly around the room. The plates I had paid for, the glasses, the catered food cooling in its silver trays, the decorations, the tree, the bright ruin of wrapping paper, the gifts. Every single object in that beautiful room had come out of my account. And I was sitting in the middle of all of it, feeling less like a father than like a man who had wandered into the wrong party and would shortly be asked to settle the tab. Then, the way these evenings always did, it passed. The complaint burned itself out. Someone laughed, wine was poured, music came up from a speaker somewhere, and the night rolled on as though nothing had happened, because for them, nothing had. But I could not put down what I had finally picked up. For 15 years I had believed I was buying memories. I understood now that what I had actually been buying, at $8,000 a year, was admission. A ticket to stand in the room. And even the ticket came with a complaint about the seat. Later, when the others had gathered upstairs, and the laughter had moved up there with them, I sat alone in the dark of the great room, with the fire going down to coals. And for the first time in 15 years, I did not ask myself the question I always asked, which was, how do I make next Christmas better? Instead, I asked a different one, a smaller one, a heavier one. What would happen if I simply stopped paying for it? The answer came almost before the question had finished forming, and it was so simple it frightened me. Next year, they would get exactly what they paid for. I did not sleep much that night. Somewhere before dawn, listening to the wind work at the eaves of a lodge I had rented and would never see again, I made a decision. And I want to tell you that I made it cleanly, that it felt like justice arriving on schedule. It did not. It felt like grief, because deciding to stop paying was also, I understood even then, deciding to stop pretending. And the pretending, for all that it had cost me, was the last thing I had that looked like a family. By the time October came, I had almost let myself forget the promise I had made in the dark of that lodge. Almost. It sat in me the whole year like a stone in a coat pocket, something I could feel the weight of whenever I reached for anything else. Then the family group chat came back to life, the way it did every autumn, and I remembered everything. It always began the same way. A few cheerful messages about the holidays, a little talk of dates, a suggestion, then another, and before long the whole apparatus was in motion, everyone planning a Christmas nobody at all intended to pay for. Renata opened it, as she always did. She dropped a link to a luxury cabin in Aspen, larger even than the last, and followed it a minute later with 3 words. "Looks perfect this. Not, what do you think? Not, can we manage this one this year? Not even, are you up for it, Nathan?" Just the flat, weightless assumption that the tradition would continue exactly as it always had, powered by the same engine it had always run on. Me. A few days later, Grant began sending links of his own. Designer coats, a set of headphones that cost more than a month of my property taxes, an accessory whose purpose I never determined. Each message read less like a wish and more like a line on an order form he expected to be filled. Paige joined a little after, and she was not focused on gifts. She wanted to talk about the catering. Could we use the same company as last year? Could they expand the dessert menu? Could they upgrade the whole holiday spread? The conversation rolled downhill, gathering plans and costs as it went, and in all of it not one person paused to ask the single question that mattered, which was who, exactly, was going to pay for any of it. Because in their minds that question had been answered years ago, and permanently, and did not need revisiting. The old version of me would have jumped in by now. I would have pushed back, gently, apologetically. I would have raised the cost, the way you raise a difficult subject at a dinner you don't want to ruin. I would have negotiated the watches down, and the dessert menu up and ended, as I always ended, by agreeing to all of it, and paying for all of it, and thanking them for the privilege. This year I did none of that. I did not object. I did not agree. I did not negotiate. I simply said nothing at all. It is a remarkable thing to watch a machine run without you, once you finally take your hands off it. Days passed, then weeks. The messages kept coming, plans firming up, and nobody noticed my silence. Or if they noticed, they read it the way they had read my silence for 15 years as consent. As the quiet, dependable hum of a man handling everything in the background, the way he always did, nobody asked. That was the part I kept turning over. Not once in all those weeks did a single message arrive that said, "Nathan, are you all right with this?" Nobody asked whether I had made the reservations. Nobody asked whether the deposits had gone through. They did not ask because it did not occur to them that they might need to. For 15 years I had trained them, patiently and at great expense, to expect it. And now I sat in my kitchen in the evenings and watched that expectation run entirely on its own, needing nothing from me, not even my agreement. As November thinned into December, the reminder emails began. The rental company wanted the balance. The catering company, a firm called Aspen Table, wanted confirmation and a deposit by a date that was fast approaching. Final payments were due. I read every one of those emails carefully, the way I used to read a load calculation, and then I closed each of them and did nothing. No reply, no payment, no explanation offered to anyone. There was one message in the middle of all that silence that I did not close so easily. It came from Karen Voss, the manager at Silver Ridge, the woman who had run the lodge the year before. She was calling, her voicemail said, because a partial deposit had come through on the reservation under my name, but the balance remained open, and she wanted to confirm the booking before releasing the dates. A partial deposit. Under my name. I had authorized nothing. It took me an evening of quiet, careful looking to understand it, and when I did, something in my chest went very still. Years earlier, when Grant was in college and forever stranded without gas money, I had added him as an authorized user on one of my cards. I had meant to remove it 100 times and never had. He had used it at some point that autumn to put down a small deposit on the very cabin he expected me to finance in full, without a word to me, without a question, as casually as a man reaching into a coat he assumes is his own. He had not asked whether I would pay for Aspen. He had simply begun spending my money on it, quietly, months in advance, so sure of the answer that the question never crossed his mind. I did not confront him. I did what I should have done years before. I called the bank the next morning and removed the authorization, and I let the small deposit stand as the only thing about that trip that would ever actually be paid. I told one person what I was doing. His name is Silas Okafor, and he lives about a mile from a small cabin I keep in Vermont, in a town called Millbrook Hollow that you will not find on most maps. Silas is a retired forest ranger, a wide, slow-moving man in his 70s, who spent 40 years watching over other people's woods and now mostly watches over his own quiet. We had become the kind of friends two solitary men become, over coffee and long silences, and the occasional shared task with a chainsaw. I told him everything one afternoon on his porch, the whole 15 years of it, and then I told him what I was planning not to do. He listened the way he did everything, without hurry, and when I finished he was quiet for a long while. "You have to ask yourself something," he said finally, looking out at his trees. "Are you doing this to punish them, or to stop punishing yourself?" I did not have an answer for him. I said so. "Then wait until you do," he said. "A man who's only trying to hurt them back will feel good on Christmas night. A man who's finally protecting himself won't feel good at all. He'll just feel like he can breathe." He turned and looked at me. You'll know which one you are by how you feel when the phone starts ringing. And it will ring, Nathan. You know it'll ring. Silas was right about the ringing, but that was still weeks away, and in the meantime I had a plan of my own to keep, one that, unlike the trip taking shape in the group chat, was actually going to be paid for. There is a thing I never told my family, and it is this. The small cabin in Millbrook Hollow is not a rental. I built it. Years ago, in the raw stretch after the divorce, when I did not know what to do with my hands or my grief, I bought a half-acre of Vermont hillside, and I built a one-room cabin on it with my own tools. A stone fireplace and a small kitchen and a single window facing a long slope of hills that ran off into the distance until they turned blue. It is the only thing I have ever built for no one's approval but my own. My family did not know it existed. It had never once occurred to any of them to ask what I did with the 11 months of the year that were not Christmas. A week before the holiday, I packed my truck. I loaded my old dog Bear into the passenger seat, an arthritic shepherd who had been with me through most of those 15 Decembers and never once complained about the view. And I drove north. Not to Aspen, not to a lodge with a name and a rafter-high tree. Just north into the cold and the pines, to the one place I had made with my own 2 hands. The cabin would not have impressed anyone I was related to. 1 room, a bed, a chair, a fire, a window. But when I came through the door and the wood stove caught and the light went gold across the plank floor, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been clenched so long I had stopped, noticing it was clenched at all. The first day was strange. I kept waiting. That is the truest thing I can tell you about that first day. 15 years of holidays had trained me to expect at any moment a complaint, a demand, a small emergency that would somehow, by the alchemy of that family, become my responsibility to fix. I kept bracing for it, and it did not come. There was only silence, and after a while I understood it was a good silence. The kind that lets you hear the wind find the corners of a building. The kind that lets a cup of coffee stay hot long enough to actually drink. The kind that reminds you, once it has gone on long enough, exactly how loud the last 15 years had been. Bear slept by the stove and I read, and walked in the snow, and split a little wood I did not need, and enjoyed the plain fact that no one on earth was waiting for me to solve their problem. And somewhere in there, on maybe the 2nd or 3rd day, I noticed something that surprised me. I was not missing Aspen. I had thought I would. I had thought some part of me would ache for the fire and the family and the noise. But I did not miss the trips at all. What I had missed all those years was not the thing itself. It was the idea of the thing. The Christmas I kept paying for was never the one we actually had. It was the one I kept hoping next year we finally would. Christmas morning came in clear and cold, with a fresh fall of snow laid clean over everything. I made breakfast, I took Bear out into it, and watched him move stiffly and joyfully through drifts up to his chest. Down in the little town, families carried wrapped boxes along the shoveled sidewalks, and I watched them from a distance with no envy at all, which was itself a kind of gift. It was, without any competition, the most peaceful Christmas I had spent in more than a decade, and yet all day I kept glancing at my phone. Not out of worry, out of something closer to the strange calm of a man who knows a thing the people around him do not yet know. Certain bills had never been paid. Certain reservations had never been confirmed, and sooner or later, on a schedule I understood better than anyone, someone 400 miles away was going to walk up to a locked door and discover it. So while the quiet day moved gently around me, I found myself checking one thing, over and over, more than the weather, more than the fire, the time, because I knew almost to the minute when reality was scheduled to arrive. I knew their itinerary by heart. 15 years teaches you a rhythm. They always drove up from the airport in the late afternoon. They always reached the lodge and checked in around 6, and dinner always followed shortly after. For 15 years the pattern had held without a single variation. This year the pattern was going to hold too, right up until the moment it shattered. The only question left was how long it would take them to understand that the thing they were standing in front of was not a delay. It was a wall. The afternoon could not have been more still. Bear stretched out full length before the fire and sighed the enormous sigh of an old dog with nothing left to guard. New snow feathered down past the window. I had nowhere to be, nothing to organize, no one demanding an update on anything. For the first time in 15 years I was not managing a holiday, I was simply having one. And then, at exactly 6 o'clock, the phone lit up. The first call was Renata. I watched the screen glow with her name, and I watched it ring, and I watched it stop. 5 seconds later, it lit again. Before that second call had finished, Grant's name appeared over the top of it, and then Paige's, and then Renata's once more, until the screen looked less like a phone and more like an alarm panel in a building where something has gone badly wrong. Call after call, message stacked on message, voicemail after voicemail piling up in a little red column. I set my coffee down on the sill. I looked at the trembling phone for a long moment, and I thought, with no triumph in it at all, only a strange and level quiet. Right on schedule. I did not answer, not yet. Instead, I read, the way you read the first reports of a storm you have been tracking for a long time. Renata's first text was not a question. Call me now. The second was no warmer. Where are you? A moment later, Grant's message came through in a wall of capital letters and broken punctuation, the written form of a man pacing a parking lot. Pages were different. Hers moved, over the space of a few minutes, from confused to worried to something close to frightened, and those were the ones I had to make myself keep reading. I opened one of the voicemails, and the whole picture assembled itself in a few seconds. The lodge had turned them away at the door. The final balance had never been paid, and without it there was no active reservation, no keys, no access, no great glass and timber cabin waiting warm above the town. Just a locked entrance and a manager, Karen Voss, explaining as kindly as she could that there was nothing she could do. At nearly the same moment they had learned the second half of it. Aspen Table had canceled the holiday dinner weeks earlier. When the deposit deadline came and went with no response. No payment, no catering, no feast laid out on a long warm table. No carefully assembled holiday experience of any kind. Nothing at all but a cold parking lot, a small mountain of luggage, and a reality none of them had ever once in 15 years had to imagine. And with each passing minute the messages grew more desperate and more revealing. Renata wanted answers. Grant wanted someone to blame, and there was only ever one candidate for that role. Paige wanted a solution. But the thing that struck me, sitting quiet by my window 400 miles away, was not that they were upset. Anyone would have been upset. What struck me was that every single message from all three of them rested on the same buried assumption, so deep none of them even knew they were making it. That I would fix it, even now, even after months of my silence, even after I had confirmed nothing, paid nothing, answered nothing. Their first instinct, standing in the cold outside a locked door, was not to solve the problem themselves. It was not even, really, to wonder what had gone wrong. It was to call me, to reach automatically for the man who had always reached back. For 15 years, I had caught every one of these crises before it could touch the ground. A canceled reservation, a billing error, a delayed flight, all of it intercepted and handled quietly so the holiday could stay perfect, and no one would ever have to know how much effort it took to keep it that way. This year, there was nothing to catch. This year, for the first time, the thing they had thrown into the air was simply going to land. And here is the part I have never told anyone but Silas, the part I am least proud of and most honest about. I nearly caved, because in the middle of all those buzzing messages, one of them was a photograph. Paige had sent it without any words. It was a picture of the four of them, standing in the lodge's parking lot in the blue last light, suitcases at their feet, breath showing white in the cold, and Paige at the edge of the frame with her arms wrapped around herself. Not looking at the camera, just looking cold and young, and lost in a way I had not seen since she was a child afraid of a thunderstorm. And every good thing in me, every reflex 15 years deep stood up at once and said, "Fix it, call the lodge. Find another cabin, wire the money. That is your daughter, standing in the snow." I actually stood up. I had my thumb over Karen Voss's number. I could have made 3 calls and had them warm inside within the hour, and some part of me wanted nothing on earth more than to do exactly that. Instead, I called Silas. He answered on the second ring, and I could hear his own fire behind him. I told him what was happening, the photo, the parking lot, Paige at the edge of it. My voice was not steady. "Am I a monster?" I asked him. "They're standing in the snow, Silas. My kids are standing in the snow." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are they in danger? Real danger? Is there a hospital they can't get to? A car that won't start? A child who'll freeze before morning?" I made myself think about it honestly. There was a town 10 minutes down the mountain, full of hotels with vacancies on Christmas, warm lobbies and open restaurants. 3 adults with phones and credit cards in each other. "No," I said. "No, they're not in danger, they're just..." Standing there. Then they're not standing in the snow because of what you did, Silas said, slowly, kindly. They're standing in the snow because for 15 years not one of them ever learned how to pick up a phone and book a room, because they never once had to. That's not you punishing them tonight, Nathan. That's them meeting, for the first time, the size of what you were carrying. You can pick it back up if you want. Nobody would blame you, but if you pick it back up now, you'll be carrying it until they bury you. He let that sit. Give it an hour, not to be cruel. To find out if there's a single one of them who, standing in a cold parking lot, thinks of anything other than making you fix it. I sat back down. I put the phone face up on the sill where I could see it, and I did the hardest thing I did that entire year, which was nothing. I waited 1 hour, not out of spite. I want that understood by you and by myself. I waited because I needed to know, just once, whether anyone in that family, faced with a problem I had not solved for them, would prove capable of solving it themselves. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the phone kept ringing, call and text and voicemail, call and text and voicemail. And I sat in the good silence and between the buzzes and let it ring, because sometimes the most honest answer a man can give is no answer at all. After nearly an hour, one message came through that was different from the rest. It was from Paige, and it said only, "We got 2 rooms at a place in town. We're okay. You don't have to do anything." It was the first message in 15 years from any of them that did not ask me for something. I read it 4 times, and then finally I answered the phone. The moment I picked up, Renata was already talking. Talking is not the right word. She was demanding in the voice of a woman who has been kept waiting and intends to make that the subject. "Nathan, where are you? What is going on? Why weren't we in the cabin?" Before I could say anything, Grant broke in from somewhere near her. "This is ridiculous. We were standing outside for an hour. The rental company says there's no reservation, there's no dinner. What did you do? What did you do?" I sat with that phrasing for a second. Not what happened. Not, is everything all right? What did you do? Paige's voice came last, and quieter and tired. "Dad, can you just tell us what's going on? Please." For a moment I only listened. Not because I was confused. Because it was, strangely, the first time all day that any of them had actually wanted to hear my voice, rather than simply summon it. When the noise finally settled, I asked one question. I kept it very simple. "Did any of you pay for the cabin?" The line went quiet. Nobody answered. So I asked the next one. "Did any of you pay the catering company?" More silence. Longer this time. The particular silence of people discovering the floor of a thing they had always assumed had no bottom. Then Renata found her footing, the way she always did. "That is not the point, Nathan." And I almost laughed, because it was so exactly the point that I did not know how to say so without it sounding cruel. 15 years, and that was still her answer. "That's not the point. The money was never the point to her. The point was that the money was supposed to be mine." I took a sip of coffee. It had gone cold hours ago, and I did not care. And I said the only thing I had come, over 15 years and one very quiet Christmas, to feel they had earned from me. I thought, I said, whoever booked it, paid for it. Silence. Total, complete silence. For the first time, and as long as I could remember, not one of them had a comeback ready. No criticism loaded and waiting. No practiced complaint. Because underneath everything, all 3 of them knew the truth of the thing, and the truth was very simple. Not one of them had ever, for 1 second, expected to pay. They had expected me to. They had always expected me to. That expectation was the oldest and most solid structure in the whole family, and I had just, without raising my voice, removed the beam that held it up. Into that silence I finally said the thing I should have said years earlier, the sentence I had been carrying so long it had worn a groove in me. I was never the one ruining Christmas. Nobody interrupted. Nobody could. I was the one financing it. The words hung in the cold 400 miles of air between us. 15 years, packed into a single sentence. And then I said the rest of it, quietly, without heat, because heat would have made it an argument, and I did not want an argument. I wanted, for once, to be heard. I told them how every holiday had drifted, year by year, away from being about family, and toward being about expectation. How each December arrived heavier than the last, more expensive and less grateful, until the entire tradition was just a very costly way of reminding me where I stood. I told them I had grown tired, more tired than I had known how to say, of being treated as the problem in a room I had paid for down to the last candle. I told them I loved them, which was true, and which was exactly why I could not keep doing this, which was also true. and which is the hardest kind of thing to make anyone believe. The call ended more or less the way you would expect. Nobody apologized. Nobody said, "You're right, we see it now." That is not how these things go, whatever the movies tell you. A few hard words were exchanged. Renata said something about drama, about how I had humiliated the family, and Grant said something worse, and Paige said very little. And then, one by one, the line went dead. But something had changed, even so. Even ending badly, something enormous had shifted, and I felt it the moment the call disconnected and the cabin went quiet around me. For the first time in 15 years, the weight was not on my shoulders. I had set it down gently in a parking lot in Aspen, and I had walked away, and the strangest part was how little the world ended as a result. I had spent a decade and a half certain that if I ever stopped carrying it, everything would collapse. It did not collapse. It just got quiet, and I sat there in the quiet with my old dog and my dying fire, and I did the accounting, and I found that I felt, for the first time in longer than I could name, like I could breathe, which is exactly what Silas had told me the right answer would feel like. The days after Christmas were quiet in a way that was, at first, hard to trust. The messages that came were not, at the start, much softer than the calls had been. There was anger in them, and frustration, and a few careful attempts to make me feel guilty for what I had done. Grant informed me that I had embarrassed the family. Renata informed me that I had manufactured a crisis out of nothing. I read them, and I did not argue, and I did not pay, and slowly, day by day, the temperature of it dropped. Paige stayed mostly out of the arguments, but every few days, quietly and away from the others, she sent a small message just to ask how I was doing. That was all. "How are you, Dad?" It does not sound like much. But I had gone 15 years without being asked that question by anyone in my own family. And the first time it arrived on my screen, I had to set the phone down and look out at the snow for a while. For the first time in a very long time, someone was asking about me instead of asking me for something. As the weeks passed, the heat went out of the whole thing, and reality had room to settle. The Aspen trip had not fallen apart because I ruined it. It had fallen apart because no one but me had ever even once taken responsibility for holding it up. That distinction mattered whether any of them chose to admit it or not, and I suspect that somewhere in the quiet after, at least one or two of them began privately to see it. The next year told me everything. December came, and the group chat woke up as it always did, and I braced for the familiar machinery. But it was different. Nobody sent a link to a luxury cabin. Nobody forwarded an expensive catering menu. Nobody assumed, out loud or in silence, that I would be covering the cost of anything. The expectation that had run that family for 15 years had at last been switched off, and it did not switch back on. I will not pretend it came free. Some of the relationships grew more distant, and I would be lying if I told you that did not cost me something. A few conversations got shorter. A few old traditions simply quietly stopped. When you remove the thing that was holding people to you, you sometimes learn how much of what held them was the thing and not you. And that is a hard piece of arithmetic to sit with at my age. But something else happened too, something I had not dared to expect. The relationships that remained began slowly to feel real. When my children called now, and they did call, it was not because a reservation needed making or a bill needed paying. It was because they wanted to talk. Those calls were not frequent, but they were true, and I had forgotten what a true one felt like. I will take one honest phone call, I have learned, over 100 entitled requests. It took me 61 years and one very cold Christmas to learn it, but I have it now, and I am not letting it go. I have had a lot of time since that Christmas to sit with what it taught me, and I want to leave you with the part that matters more than any locked door or unpaid bill. For most of my life, I believed that generosity meant saying yes. That to love people was to give them whatever they asked for, and then to give a little more, and to keep giving until the giving itself became invisible, just the water they swam in. I thought a good man was a man who never made anyone carry their own weight, if he could carry it for them. I know now that I had it half wrong, and that the missing half nearly cost me everything, including myself. Because real generosity, the kind that actually nourishes the people it reaches, has a shape to it. It has edges. It has a place where it ends and you begin. Giving without a boundary is not love. It is a slow erasure of you, and it teaches the people you love the worst possible lesson, which is that you are not a person to be considered but a resource to be used. When kindness becomes an expectation, Gratitude quietly dies because you cannot be grateful for something you have stopped being able to see. I made my family blind to me, one generous year at a time, and then I blamed them for not seeing. That was my share of it, and I own it. There is a particular danger, I have come to think, for the ones who are always able to give. The steady ones, the ones with the house and the account, and the calm hands that fix what breaks. The world learns very fast that you will catch what it drops, and then it stops looking to see whether your arms are tired. If that is you, if you are the one everyone reaches for and no one asks after, hear me, you are allowed to set it down. Loving people does not require you to disappear underneath them. The most generous thing I ever did for my children was not the 15 years of Christmases I paid for. It was the one Christmas I did not, the year I finally let them feel the true weight of a thing and discover, standing in a cold parking lot, that they were strong enough to carry it themselves. I had been robbing them of that strength for years and calling it love. Boundaries are not the opposite of love. They are the shape love takes when it finally respects itself and the people it is offered to, enough to be honest. It took me until my 60s and a locked door in the mountains to understand that. I hope, wherever you are watching from, it does not take you nearly so long. If this story reached something in you, if you have ever been the one who pays and is somehow still the problem, then stay with me a while. Leave a comment and tell me what you would have done. Standing at that window with the phone ringing, would you have answered right away? Or would you have let them find their own way inside? And if these are the kinds of stories you want more of, the quiet ones, about family and dignity and the cost of always saying yes, then follow along, and I will keep telling them for as long as you keep listening. This story was written and told by a person, a real one, with a lifetime of watching people give too much and ask for too little in return. The names have been changed and the details reshaped, but the truth underneath it is one I believe with my whole heart, and I wanted you to hear it from a human being, not a machine. Thank you for sitting by the fire with me tonight. Take care of yourself out there. And do not forget, whoever you are, that you are allowed to set the weight down.